What's the secret of a long marriage? It's like you don't get divorced.
Olivia and George Harrison shared a long and, by all accounts, deeply happy marriage. She helped him recover from his divorce from Patty Boyd, and the two connected on an almost spiritual level through shared interests and similar upbringings. As a famously private Beatle, George wasn't always easy to reach, but Olivia later released a poetry collection to reveal his true character. She also continues to champion his musical legacy, work that has helped her carry on after his loss. Stick around to find out why George Harrison's widow, Olivia, may have found love again.
Sometimes people say, what's the secret of a long marriage? It's like you don't get divorced. And I think, you go through challenges in your marriage, and here's what I found. First time we had a big hiccup in the road, you go through things, you go, wow, there's a reward at the other end of it. There's this incredible reward. You love each other more. You learn something. You let go of something. You get those hard edges get softened. You're that block of stone, and life shapes you and takes away those hard edges.
Meeting Olivia. People love asking Olivia Harrison what the secret to a long marriage actually is, as if there's one clean answer that fits on a greeting card. Her real response is far more honest than that. She said the secret isn't avoiding hardship, it's what happens after the hardship hits. In her own words, the first time a marriage runs into a real obstacle, something breaks open, and on the other side of that break is a reward you didn't expect. A deeper love, a lesson learned, something released. She's described it almost like being a block of stone, life slowly chipping away the sharp, hard edges over time until what's left is something smoother, something better shaped for staying together. It's not a romantic fairy tale answer, and that's exactly why it rings true. It's the answer of someone who actually lived through the hard parts and came out the other side still standing beside the same person. That philosophy is exactly how Olivia and George Harrison built one of the more enduring marriages to come out of the Beatles' orbit, a relationship that lasted more than 2 decades, and, by nearly every account from people who knew them, was genuinely happy. She helped him work through the wreckage of his first marriage, at a time when he was reportedly still spiraling from the fallout of losing his wife to one of his closest friends. The two of them connected on something closer to a spiritual level, bonded by overlapping interests and surprisingly similar upbringings, rather than the typical celebrity romance built on convenience or proximity. And that mattered enormously, because George Harrison had a reputation, even among his own bandmates, as someone who kept the world at a careful distance. He wasn't an easy man to get close to, famously guarded even in interviews, often letting Lennon and McCartney soak up the spotlight, while he retreated into his own private world of music and spirituality. Decades later, Olivia would publish a poetry collection specifically to let people finally see the version of him that only she really knew, the husband and father rather than the mythologized rock star, and she's continued working ever since to protect and honor the legacy of his music, work that has, in its own way, helped her keep moving forward without him. To understand how they actually found each other, you have to rewind to the collapse of George's first marriage, a relationship that itself reads like something out of a soap opera involving 3 of the most recognizable names in music. He'd met Patty Boyd on the set of A Hard Day's Night back in 1964, and the two fell for each other quickly, marrying in 1966 at the height of Beatlemania. It didn't last. Eric Clapton, one of George's closest friends and musical peers, fell in love with Patty too, and would go on to write some of his most famous songs, including Layla and Wonderful Tonight, directly about her, songs that remain some of the most enduring love songs in rock history, despite, or perhaps because of, the complicated real-life triangle behind them. George stuck with the marriage until Patty made clear she wanted out, and she formally separated from him in June of 1974, a period she later detailed in the memoir she co-wrote with Penny Junor. George had reportedly floated the idea of divorce himself around Christmas of 1973, and by his own admission, the aftermath hit him hard. In a 1979 interview with Rolling Stone, he described going on what he called a bit of a bender to make up for all the years I'd been married. Still, from 1974 onward, he made a point of keeping things amicable. He wasn't angry at Patty, and he wasn't angry at Eric either. He was genuinely glad the two of them had found each other, and remarkably, all three remained friends for the rest of their lives. A rare outcome for a breakup involving that much heartbreak and that much fame. George met Olivia only a few months after separating from Patty, though his divorce wasn't yet finalized. The two connected over the phone in 1974 while working together to set up George's Dark Horse record label, a business relationship that shifted into something romantic almost immediately. Olivia was working in the music industry herself at the time, which meant she understood exactly the kind of world George lived in, something that likely made their early connection easier than it might have been with someone entirely outside that life. He'd go on to write music for her, most notably the song Dark Sweet Lady, a tribute to how she'd helped carry him through a genuinely difficult period of his life. Even with everything between George, Patty, and Eric staying friendly, Eric reportedly took Olivia aside and warned her that the bender George had gone on might not actually be finished yet. It rattled her, understandably, but not enough to walk away. She stayed by his side through the Dark Horse Tour, which kicked off on November 2, 1974, and by December of that year, her picture was appearing on the artwork for the Dark Horse album itself, with George thanking her directly in the liner credits. She also appeared in the accompanying promotional film Ding Dong Ding Dong, a clear public signal that this relationship wasn't going anywhere. Divorcing Patty. George's divorce from Patty wouldn't actually be finalized until 1977, and getting there took far longer than either of them probably wanted, largely because of how unforgiving British divorce law was at the time. Divorce in the UK during the 1970s made things unnecessarily brutal, requiring one spouse to formally sue the other on grounds like adultery or unreasonable behavior just to get the process moving, essentially forcing couples to publicly air grievances even when both sides simply wanted to move on peacefully. George wanted no part of that. He had no interest in dragging things through court, and he certainly didn't want to torch his friendship with Patty or Eric in the process, especially given how much effort all three had already put into keeping things civil. Fortunately, English law offered another path, a no-fault divorce, but only if the couple had lived apart for a full 2 years first, with no shortcuts and no exceptions. That's exactly the route George and Patty took, quietly waiting out the required separation period, rather than fighting things out publicly or dragging lawyers into what had otherwise remained a remarkably respectful split. Their divorce was finally granted on June 9, 1977, closing that chapter cleanly and true to form, without any real bitterness lingering between anyone involved. A rare and almost unheard-of outcome for a rock star divorce, playing out under constant tabloid scrutiny. Wedded bliss with Olivia. By the time the divorce was finalized, George and Olivia had already been building a life together for years, quietly, away from the same tabloid glare that had followed his first marriage. Things were about to move quickly. In February of 1978, Olivia discovered she was pregnant with their son, Donnie. The couple had already been planning to marry, but those plans were interrupted when George's father passed away that May, and out of respect for the loss, they made the decision to postpone the wedding until after their child was born, choosing family and grief over ceremony without a second thought. Donnie arrived on August 1st, 1978, and just about a month later, on September 2nd, George and Olivia were finally married in a private ceremony far removed from the spectacle that had surrounded his wedding to Patty over a decade earlier. They would remain together for the rest of George's life, more than 20 years, in a marriage that largely stayed out of the public eye by choice. Something in George genuinely seemed to settle once he became a father. Friends and interviewers alike noticed a calmer, more grounded version of him emerging in that period. A man who'd spent much of his adult life chasing spiritual answers, now finding something closer to peace in ordinary domestic life. He talked about fatherhood with a kind of plain, unguarded warmth that wasn't always typical of him publicly, saying simply that everyone thinks their own baby is wonderful, and that his son actually was. He said he was enjoying being a father a great deal, and for a man who'd spent so long being cautious about letting people in, that kind of open contentment said a lot about how much his life had changed since meeting Olivia. Those close to the couple often described their home life as remarkably normal for two people who'd lived through Beatlemania and its aftermath, full of gardening, quiet routines, and a shared devotion to raising their son away from the spotlight as much as possible. Attempted attack turned out to be far. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at a friend's home in Los Angeles, with Olivia and their son Donnie by his side, bringing an end to a marriage that had weathered far more than most people ever realized. Remembering her rock star. In the years since George's death, Olivia has never really stepped away from his legacy. She's simply carried it forward in her own way, becoming one of the primary caretakers of both his musical catalog and his memory. When the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for a second time, this time as individual artists rather than as a group, she spoke about him with nothing but warmth and pride, standing in for the husband who could no longer accept the honor himself. She's overseen reissues of his recording catalog, making sure new generations can access his music the way it was meant to be heard, painstakingly remastering and re-releasing albums that had grown difficult to find in their original form. She currently sits as one of the 5 directors of Apple Corps, the company controlling the Beatles' business empire, alongside Yoko Ono, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr, a role that puts her directly in charge of protecting not just George's legacy, but the legacy of the band as a whole. She also produced the Concert for George, an all-star tribute performance held at Royal Albert Hall featuring artists like Eric Clapton, Ravi Shankar's family, and members of Monty Python, honoring both his musical and spiritual interests. Beyond that, she's continued producing documentaries, films, and box sets tied to his work and story, treating the preservation of his legacy less like a business obligation and more like a genuine act of love. For the 20th anniversary of his death, Olivia released a poetry collection containing more than 20 pieces reflecting on their life together, accompanied by previously unreleased photographs and artwork that had never been shown publicly before. The book includes a foreword written by their longtime friend Martin Scorsese, who directed the acclaimed 2011 documentary George Harrison, Living in the Material World, a film Olivia herself worked closely on. Scorsese wrote of the collection that it's a work that celebrates love while seeing clearly its transitory nature, a fitting description for a book born entirely out of grief, transformed into something beautiful. Olivia herself wrote the accompanying book to pair with that documentary, and its verses explore the similarities in how she and George were raised. The the strange adjustment of loving someone swallowed by global celebrity, and much more personal, private terrain most fans never got to see. The kind of intimate detail that simply never made it into official biographies or press coverage. When she was asked why she turned to poetry specifically to process everything, her answer was almost disarmingly honest. She said she didn't really choose it. It chose her. She'd hit a genuinely low point back in 2018, and a friend of hers, who happens to be a neurologist, suggested she try reading poetry as a way through it. Something about that process sparked her own writing, almost involuntarily, words simply beginning to arrive on their own. She said she considers the resulting book far more personal and revealing than any traditional autobiography could have been, hoping it lets readers see intimate physical details about George that only someone who truly knew him would notice, right down to how he actually got the scars on his fingers, small human details that no official biography would have thought to include. Rumors of a new partner. More recently, Olivia's name has resurfaced in the headlines for a very different reason, one that has nothing to do with grief and everything to do with speculation about what might come next in her life. Former Journey frontman Steve Perry recorded a new version of the Beatles song I Need You for his solo album Traces, released on October 5th, marking his first solo record since 1994's For the Love of Strange Medicine, a gap of roughly 3 decades between projects. When asked why he chose that particular song, Perry explained that he'd first heard it as a teenager, sung in a bossa nova style, and even at a young age something told him the song deserved bigger treatment. He said he always heard it in his head as something closer to an R&B arrangement, a bigger, more soulful version of what George had written, something he'd been quietly imagining since he was 16 or 17 years old, without ever expecting he'd actually get the chance to record it himself decades later. Perry also shared the story of how he secured Olivia's blessing before releasing his version, a step he clearly considered essential rather than optional. He explained that a close friend of his, Steve Ferrone, happened to be close with Olivia Harrison personally, and Perry mentioned he'd love the chance to play her the track and get her approval someday, almost as an offhand wish rather than a real plan. His friend followed through, came back with Olivia's contact information, and told him to simply reach out. Perry described being genuinely nervous emailing her, choosing every word carefully out of respect for both her and George's memory, treating the exchange with the kind of reverence you'd expect from someone approaching a piece of music history rather than just another cover song. In the end, he got exactly what he was hoping for, her blessing on the recording, something he's described as one of the more meaningful moments of putting the album together. That single detail was enough to send speculation spinning well beyond a simple approval for a cover song. Given that Olivia's relationship with George himself began as a professional connection that gradually turned romantic, some couldn't help but wonder whether history might be quietly repeating itself in some form. Fueling the chatter further, Olivia and Steve Perry were spotted together in Las Vegas at a performance of Love, the Cirque du Soleil show built entirely around the Beatles' catalog, and the two even posed together for a photo with one of the show's performers afterward, a photo that quickly made the rounds online. Perry also showed up in person to support Olivia at a public reading from her poetry collection, later posting warmly about the event on social media, further stoking curiosity from fans who'd been tracking the two of them together across multiple public appearances. None of it amounts to any kind of confirmed romantic relationship, and both parties have kept the actual nature of their friendship private, but it's been more than enough to catch the attention of tabloids eager for a new chapter in her story after so many years spent primarily as George Harrison's grieving widow. Whatever the truth turns out to be, Olivia Harrison's life since George's passing has been defined less by rumor and more by devotion to his music, to his memory, and to making sure the world never forgets who he really was behind the fame, the private, guarded man rather than the mythologized Beatle. Whether or not a new chapter with Steve Perry or anyone else ever becomes official, her track record over the past 2 decades suggests she'll continue moving through it the same way she's moved through everything else in her remarkable life, with patience, with grace, and with the same quiet resilience that carried her through more than 2 decades beside one of the most famous and most private men in music history. From a phone call about a record label to more than 2 decades of marriage, a near-fatal attack, and a life spent guarding a legacy, Olivia Harrison's story turned out to be just as compelling as any.